note on that is just what I wanted to say here. This is why you always just go, just go take a look. Particularly if it's an open access article like this, and just see, does it make sense what they're doing? Here, does it make sense that the conclusion made here? Now, by now, a bunch of you may have seen this article from the New York Post. Masks Reduce Racism study is latest sign U.S. medical establishment is insanely, perilously woke, by Carol Markowitz, Washington Post. Washington Post, New York Post, excuse me. Um, but it's, I read it and I thought, oh, I read the headline and I thought, surely not. And so I go and read a little bit further. Here, and I'm not going to read all this article, but there is just the first couple of paragraphs gives the point here. Is there anything masking can't do, except for control COVID spread, of course? Again, author's opinion, not necessarily mine. A new study in the New England Journal of Medicine purports to show that mask policies in schools work to contain COVID, but that's not all. The authors conclude, quote, we believe that universal masking may be especially useful for mitigating effects of structural racism in schools, including potential deepening of educational inequities. Okay. I thought to myself, I read that and I thought, there's no way. There's no way that could be what's actually said. And it turns out that is what is actually said in the study. This is the study in question, and if you're curious, and I encourage you very much to go take a look at it, because it is an open access paper, which means, what that means, of course, with open access is it is not behind the paywall. You can go in and read it for yourself. I encourage you to do so in here, and I think you would find it interesting for sure. And they use a what's called a structured abstract here. And the quote that Carol Markowitz pulled is not only in the abstract, it's actually in the discussion of results section too. So allow me to read the abstract for you really quickly. In February 2022, Massachusetts rescinded a statewide universal masking policy in public schools, and many Massachusetts school districts lifted masking requirements during the subsequent weeks. In the greater Boston area, only 2 school districts, the Boston and neighboring Chelsea districts, sustained masking requirements through June of 2022. The staggered lifting of masking requirements provided an opportunity to examine the effect of universal masking policies on the incidence of coronavirus disease 2019 COVID-19 in schools. Now, notice they're only focused on cases, nothing to do with severity in this particular instance. We used a difference in differences analysis for staggered policy implementation to compare the incidence of COVID-19 among students and staff in school districts in the greater Boston area that lifted masking requirements and the incidences in districts that sustained masking requirements during the 2021-2022 school year. Characteristics of school districts were also compared. Okay. Before the statewide masking policy was rescinded, trends in the incidence of COVID-19 were similar across school districts. We'll get to that in a second. I'm not going to do a full review on this article, just for the record, because this isn't one that's necessarily about that. I want to make a point with this of when there's a conclusion that is made, or a statement that is made, like the one that got highlighted in the New York Post article, what behooves us to do, and what I tend to do with these things, is to go look in the study for the analysis that supports that, and to see if it actually supports that claim. Shocker is it probably doesn't. Just spoiler alert. During the 15 weeks after the statewide masking policy was rescinded, the lifting of masking requirements was associated with an additional 44.9 cases per 1,000 students and staff, 95% confidence interval 32.6 to 57.1, which corresponded to an estimated 11,901 cases and to 29.4% of the cases in all districts during that time. So, let's see. We make a point here. Lifting masking requirements was associated with an additional 44 cases, and which corresponded to 11,901 cases, 29.4% of the cases during that time. So in other words, cases in all districts, in all school districts, that mind you. So in all school districts, as they say here in their results, the lifting of masking requirements was 30% of the cases that resulted. Okay, interesting finding. Districts that chose to sustain the masking requirements longer tended to have school buildings that were older and in worse condition, and to have more students per classroom than districts that chose to lift masking requirements earlier. In addition, these districts had higher percentages of low-income students, students with disabilities, students who were English language learners, as well as higher percentages of Black and Latinx students and staff. Our results support universal masking as an important strategy for reducing COVID-19 incidents in schools and loss of in-person school days. As such, we believe that universal masking may be especially useful for mitigating effects of structural racism in schools, including potential deepening of educational inequities. Okay, one does not follow from the other here. And if you were only reading the abstract, you would probably actually think that one did not follow from the other in this. This was snuck into the abstract, but no support was given for it in the abstract. Among school districts in the greater Boston area, the lifting of masking requirements was associated with This basically is exactly the same as what's up here. So, where do they actually talk about this? So, what the approach was here was a difference in differences kind of thing, and I'll show you what that is in a second. So, let's see. Okay. Where's the actual? There we go. So here's the first figure that they have. I wanted to find this first rather than going down here because a picture is worth 1,000 words. Oh shoot. Hold on. I just noticed. Oh goodness, that is unhelpful. All right. I just noticed that it's actually not showing the figures very well in this thing. So maybe there we go. Might actually be better seen in the PDF. Yes, here we go. Yes, much better seen in the PDF. There we go. Apologies for having to figure that out. So, weekly COVID-19 cases per 1,000. This is pre-lifting all these masking things. Now, there's some observations that we can make with this, in that, and it's pretty much the same kind of idea as you go along. This is students and staff together. This top line is lifted within a week. Notice it's 46 school districts. The next line down here, the next kind of colored one here, is lifted within the second week. And lifted in the third week. And then the dark black line is, it was not lifted at all, at least not until June of 2022. I want to make a point that it never gets back to, you never get back to the actual incidences here, just as incidences that were occurring pre-masking. Dropped off pretty quickly and then it came back up. Fine, whatever. In here. So this is sort of a raw data thing here more than anything. It's COVID-19 cases per 1,000. That's not the point that I wanted to make with this. So weekly differences. So where is the actual caption of the figure? Wait a second. Oh, here it is. Ha! The way they printed the New England Journal of Medicine is unhelpful. So difference in difference models were used to connect it here. So estimates are shown. Vertical dash lines indicate the first reporting week. Okay. So basically, if I have read this correctly, in here, trying to make sure I have this right before I say something myself here. Difference in difference models were used to estimate the difference in change in the incidence of COVID-19 between school districts that lifted masking requirements and school districts that sustained masking requirements in each reporting week among students and staff overall, among students alone, and among staff alone, with estimates calculated on a weekly basis. Panel A, cumulative base. Panel B, I bars and blue shading indicate 95% confidence intervals for weekly and cumulative differences, respectively. Estimates are shown according to the reporting week since masking requirements were lifted. Vertical dashed lines indicate the first reporting week in which masking requirements were lifted in each school district. Because the reporting week in which masking requirements were lifted, values in light blue and dark blue show differences between the reporting weeks and what have you. Details regarding difference and yeah. So you're basically talking about, reporting week since masking requirements were lifted in here. So coming from the initial Omicron wave, this is the week at which masking was lifted, marked by the 0. This is the weeks after that. Those kinds of things. Weekly differences, and then it's cumulative kind of thing. Cumulative differences here. In all of that kind of thing. But where they get into, you notice that nothing I've said has been actually about the race of anybody so far, and that universal masking will help with structural racism. I always check for, what data is there actually to support that. And the only analysis that was actually presented in the main body of this paper was this 4-panel plot, figure 3, that is, shall we say, basically just showing me demographic differences between school districts. And that's about it. What it doesn't show me is essentially what the incidences of COVID-19 were. It doesn't show me necessarily, well, I mean, you can kind of correlate it indirectly if you're looking at the other plots. I'm not gonna say no on that one. But it doesn't tell me anything about whether or not structural racism caused something, or if universal masking would help. What was the conclusion? Hold on a second before I totally forget. The conclusion that they made: we believe that universal masking may be especially useful for mitigating effects of structural racism in schools, including potential deepening of educational inequities. Okay, 2 things. This is the only data, the entirety of the paper that they showed. And there's a couple of paragraphs, and I believe... yes. Yeah. There's a couple of paragraphs basically just digging on capitalism and going off on a bunch of ideological stuff here. Yeah, the decision in some school... here's the key quote from this particular paragraph. The decision in some school districts to sustain school masking policies longer may therefore reflect an understanding among parents and elected officials that structural racism is embedded in public policies and that policy decisions have the potential to rectify or reproduce health inequities. Oh, brother. And then in the final thing here, it just talks about failure to consider unequal baseline conditions and ongoing inequitable effects of COVID-19 policies risk further exacerbating inequities in COVID-19 incidences and educational outcomes. Okay. Nothing about this presented analysis here backs any of that up. And the reason I say that is because this is a classic example to me of the single cause fallacy as applied with different groups of people, and or as it's more commonly known when you're dealing with different groups of people in the social categorization side of it, what Coleman Hughes has referred to as the disparity fallacy, assuming that because a disparity exists, then structural racism must for some reason be the reason for that. Must in some way be the reason for that. That is the single cause fallacy. In the formal sense, it is the disparity fallacy, as Coleman Hughes puts it. Showing me a disparity does not prove the reason why. And nor does necessarily citing a whole bunch of other studies here. And the reason why is the same studies may very well make the same logically fallacious mistake. That the cause behind this is structural racism. Because the best that I can determine, because they never, in this study, for that particular conclusion that they make, They never say anything about um, universal masking in any of the two paragraphs in the discussion that are about structural racism, so to speak. Lots of postmodernist jargon, I'm noticing. But they never make that leap. And for me, had I been reviewing this, I would have flagged it for that, because you never actually demonstrated your point in the slightest, and yet you're making it a key point in your conclusion. And it's certainly not only in the abstract, actually. I believe it is, that statement itself is also in the conclusion. Our results support that universal masking with high quality master operators during video. Okay, no. Our results also suggest that universal masking may be an important tool for mitigating the effects of structural racism in schools, including the differential risk of severe COVID-19, educational disruptions, and health and economic effects of secondary transmission to household members. Nothing of what they have shown me proves that. Nothing what they have shown me of their results even suggests that to me. You've shown me a disparity. You have not shown me that universal masking would actually fix that necessarily. You've not shown me that at all in this. With just a graphic and a bit of analysis like this, no. It doesn't actually show that. You didn't actually make the communicative leap with the analysis and results to get to that point. Now, I suppose that it could be argued that because, what is it? Where is it? Here it is. Because the districts that sustained masking had a lower caseload count here, and most of those districts had were of particular, had majority particular groups, which is what they're saying here, is the districts that sustained masking tended to have a greater percentage of the population of students that were either Black or Hispanic, because I don't know what they're looking at here. That said, I want to make a point about something here, in that they had a grand total of 2 districts of the 70 some odd. That is a really low sample for this, compared to the others having, 46, 17, and 7. It actually got lower and lower as you went along. So that's something that bothers me in this, is that there's not necessarily an adjustment for the amount of population, or for the size of the sample. And the size of the sample is ridiculously small. It's kind of hard to tell, but the dots in these individual things are the individual districts and where they compare. So this is the variability of that box plot is just captured with 2 dots in here, whereas this is very highly variable right here. This is also very highly variable. This is very highly variable right here, actually. There's a number of these where it's actually this I would call very highly variable, actually. And actually, now that I look at this again, one of them had, because the way this scaled variable value thing works is that it's a number of standard deviations off from the mean. So the mean percentage of students who are Black, for example, at what we're looking at, if the number is negative, then it's less than the average number. If it's positive, it's more than the average number, and it's by however many standard deviations. So it would depend. There's lots of schools. There's some school because there's only 2 schools. This is the fun part. Because there's only 2 schools here. One of them actually has a negative number here. 2 schools, 2 districts. Excuse me, 2 districts. Because one of them has a negative number here. It actually has less than the average number of the average percentage of students that the percentage of students at that school district that are Black is less than the average for across the school district. This one is way more. So I'm kind of like, huh? And then you could look at some of this very similarly in some of these places, because it's like some of this is actually like way down here, very negative actually, and some of this is very positive, and this is very positive. A lot of things that are very positive in here. So I don't know that I necessarily find the conclusions to be very robust about some of the demographic relationships when you have a grand total of 2 districts that were that fell into that category of sustaining masking. So, I question that some of the robustness of the statistics that way. That said, you're still only showing me a disparity. You're still only showing me a disparity, even if a weak one, because again, the variability is so high, particularly in some of those bar plots with the sustained masking group, because you have 2 and they're on like opposite ends of the bar plot because of the way this is plotted here. Yeah, no, I question whether or not this is valid. Well, not valid. That's not the best way to put it. I question whether or not the conclusions and trends with the demographics are appropriate when you are talking about a grand total of 2 districts, and in the 3rd week, 7 districts. That is questionable because the sample size is at that point really small. At least in terms of how you're phrasing it here with the different districts. Now, with that in mind, though, if we take the assumption then that these are valid data points and you've got the valid disparities, which I'm presuming they are because they're just pulling from demographic data courtesy of the state of Massachusetts. Here's the thing, though. You've shown me a disparity, but you've made this leaping conclusion that the reason for some of the things you're seeing is because of structural racism or exposure to structural racism, making an assumption there. And then making the further assumptive leap that doing universal masking would eliminate the inequities that you see, or to put it more precisely, the disparities that you're showing me. Oops, I'm just occurring to me that it's not entirely on screen. The disparities that you're showing me. Showing me that there is a disparity does not mean you've shown me and proven what the cause of that disparity is. And that's why I don't think the conclusion that they make and the assumption that they make that doing universal masking would reduce that disparity is necessarily valid. And, a good point, and here's a book I recommend everybody read, is Thomas Sowell's Discrimination and Disparities, because he goes through this in depth, and he rips apart the idea that, the disparities between groups are only ever caused by one of 2 things. Of course, you have the one characteristic, some groups just say, oh, it's all the result of individual choice and responsibility, and what have you. Then you have the opposite end of the spectrum, which is where the postmodernist stuff has gone, that no. If there's a disparity between groups, it's because of some discrimination that's holding them back and systemic racism and what have you. Making the very flawed assumption that if you removed every barriers and you didn't have any discrimination that was happening in the negative stereotypical kind of sense, that you would have perfectly even distributions of everything, or that you would have random distributions of everything, which is not necessarily true, because those 2 things are not the only things that play into whether or not that could happen. And certainly it's not the case that only one of them plays in any given case. In any given singular case, there's always a lot more causes in that. Hence the reason why the disparity fallacy, presuming that every single disparity is the result of some kind of systemic discrimination, is flawed. It's a logical fallacy. It's unfortunate that it's crept its way into medicine. But note on that is just what I wanted to say here. This is why you always just go take a look, particularly if it's an open access article like this, and just see, does it make sense what they're doing? Here, does it make sense that the conclusion made here? And I do not think that this conclusion here with the universal masking thing and structural racism is valid or backed up by their analysis. Because it's not. They did nothing to actually demonstrate that. And seem to rely quite a lot on the disparity fallacy. But that's just me. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way out the door. Comment on the video. Share the video. Subscribe to the channel. All that good to the channel. All that good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. Stay curious, everybody.